My name is Riley. I am 30 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family treated my type 1 diabetes not as a medical condition, but as an annoying flaw that ruined their perfect image. I am a senior compliance auditor for a massive healthcare network, a job that requires cold logic and a sharp eye for fraud. 10 days ago, my own sister held my life-saving insulin over a kitchen sink and laughed as she poured it down the drain, mocking me while my organs began to shut down. Today, she sobbed hysterically in a federal courtroom as the judge read her attempted murder charges aloud. But to understand how a golden child ended up in handcuffs, you have to go back to the dinner where my family decided my life was worth less than their fake luxury lifestyle. The ambush happened at an ultra-exclusive steakhouse in downtown Chicago. I had barely taken a bite of my meal when my mother Brenda slid a thick stack of legal documents right over my plate. She and my father Thomas owned a highly lucrative chain of boutique medi spas. They always cared more about aesthetics than actual substance. Sitting across from me was my sister Vanessa. At 32, she was the undisputed golden child, dripping in designer brands and entitlement. Next to her sat her husband Kendrick, a 34-year-old African-American real estate developer who loved playing the part of a high-rolling mogul. "Sign right there at the bottom," Brenda said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the paper. "It is just a standard transfer of deed." I stared at the document. It was a legal transfer for my luxury downtown condo. My family falsely believed I had only inherited a small fraction of the property from a distant relative and leased the rest. They had no idea I had bought it outright with my own money, thanks to my highly successful auditing career. "Why on earth would I sign over my home to you?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Kendrick leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, with a patronizing, smooth smile. "Look, Riley, my firm is just facing a minor temporary liquidity issue. It is a cash flow hiccup. We need the equity in your place to secure a bridge loan. It is a sacrifice for the family legacy. You sign the condo over to me, I leverage it for the bailout, and we all win." I looked at him in disbelief. "You want me to give you my home so you can pay off your business debts?" Vanessa rolled her eyes and let out a cruel, sharp laugh. "Oh, please, Riley, you are a single diabetic spreadsheet checker. What does someone like you even need with a massive downtown space anyway? You just sit at home checking math all day. Kendrick is building an empire. You should be honored to help him." I pushed the documents back toward the center of the table. "If Kendrick is building such a massive empire," I said, looking directly at my sister, "why did he just buy you a $90,000 luxury SUV last month? If you need cash so badly, sell the car." The table went dead silent. Kendrick's arrogant smile slipped, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. Vanessa's face turned bright red. "How dare you speak to your brother-in-law that way?" Thomas snapped. His voice was low but carrying the heavy, commanding tone he always used to force me into submission. "Kendrick is the primary earner of this family. He is married to your sister. You are going to sign those papers right now, Riley, or there will be severe consequences." "I am not signing anything," I replied. "My assets are my own." Thomas slammed his fist softly against the table, leaning in close. "If you walk out of here without signing that deed, you are no longer a part of this family. We will cut you off completely. And worse, I will personally remove you from our premium medical insurance plan tomorrow morning. Let us see how long you survive when you have to pay for your expensive insulin out of your own pocket." They looked at me with smug satisfaction. They honestly believed they had me trapped. My parents assumed that because I was a diabetic, I was entirely dependent on their business insurance policy to stay alive. They had no clue that my corporate compliance job provided top-tier medical coverage or that I had quietly removed myself from their plan 3 years ago. They thought my chronic illness made me weak and reliant on their charity. I felt a cold, sharp realization wash over me. My own parents were willing to weaponize my medical condition and threaten my physical survival, all to fund the flashy, fake lifestyle of their golden child and her husband. They did not care if I lost my home. They did not care if I lost my medication. They only cared about keeping up appearances. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calmly reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and dropped it right on top of my half-eaten steak. "My health and my home are not your poker chips," I said. "Keep the condo papers. You are going to need them to write down your bankruptcy plans." I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked away from the table. As I headed toward the exit, I glanced back over my shoulder. Vanessa was glaring at me, her eyes wide and burning with a hatred so unhinged it made my skin crawl. Kendrick looked desperate, gripping his wine glass until his knuckles turned white. Thomas and Brenda were staring at the $100 bill in pure shock. I stepped out into the freezing Chicago night air, breathing a deep sigh of relief. I thought walking out of that restaurant would be the end of their control over me. I thought establishing a firm boundary would finally force them to leave me alone. I was completely wrong. My refusal to hand over my life savings did not make them back down. It made them desperate. And desperate people are capable of doing monstrous things. I had no idea that my simple act of saying no had just set the stage for a home invasion, a brutal betrayal, and a fight for my very life. 2 days passed in a deceptive, heavy silence. I threw myself into my work, using the complex rhythm of numbers and regulations to block out the memory of my family's sheer entitlement. I was sitting at the sleek glass desk in the center of my downtown Chicago condo, entirely absorbed in a massive federal healthcare audit for my firm. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. My screens were filled with thousands of rows of billing codes, insurance claims, and compliance algorithms. I was hunting for phantom billing patterns in a sea of data, a task that required absolute focus and a cold, analytical mind. It was my sanctuary. My continuous glucose monitor beeped softly on my arm, a quiet reassurance that my levels were perfectly stable. Then the sharp metallic click of my front door deadbolt echoing through the quiet apartment shattered everything. I froze my fingers, hovering over my keyboard. I lived alone. I had not given anyone authorized access to my building, let alone my front door. Before I could even stand up to investigate, the heavy oak door was shoved open with such violent force that the handle slammed hard against the entryway wall, leaving an immediate dent in the drywall. Vanessa marched into my home like a hurricane of manic fury. Her usually flawless designer blowout was frayed and wild, and her expensive trench coat was thrown haphazardly over her shoulders. I stared at her in pure shock. My mind raced, trying to understand how she had bypassed the building's security and my personal locks, until I remembered a specific afternoon 6 months ago. My mother, Brenda, had insisted on holding a spare key for absolute emergencies, claiming it was a mother's right to ensure her daughter's safety in the big city. She had sworn she would never use it without my permission. She had secretly copied it and handed it straight to her golden child. "What are you doing in my home?" I demanded, pushing my chair back and standing up. "You are trespassing. Get out right now before I call the police." Vanessa ignored my words entirely. She closed the distance between the entryway and my home office. In seconds, her eyes wide and burning with a frantic, unhinged desperation I had never seen before. She slammed her heavy leather handbag onto my pristine glass desk, knocking over a stack of compliance reports. "You ruined everything!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Kendrick's accounts are frozen. All of them. The banks will not let us withdraw a single cent. We tried to wire the earnest money for a new commercial property this morning and the transaction was blocked. They are auditing his entire real estate portfolio, Riley. His assets are completely locked down." I took a step back, my mind trying to process her frantic confession. Federal holds on accounts of that size did not just happen over a simple cash flow hiccup. They happened when financial institutions suspected massive systemic fraud. But Vanessa did not care about the legal implications of her husband's frozen funds. She only cared about her immediate lifestyle, and in her twisted, narcissistic mind, I was the only obstacle standing in her way. "You are going to fix this," she demanded, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out the exact same crumpled legal transfer documents they had ambushed me with at the steakhouse. She slammed the papers down onto my keyboard. "Sign the collateral forms. Sign them right now. Kendrick needs this property to secure an emergency private bridge loan by the end of the day, or we are going to default on 3 different construction sites. You need to leave, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rapid pounding of my heart. I am not signing over my home to bail out Kendrick's shady business practices. If the bank's locked his accounts, he needs a lawyer, not my condo. Now get out. My refusal sent her entirely over the edge. Vanessa let out a sound of pure rage and lunged at my desk. She swept her arm across the glass surface, violently throwing my audit documents, my notebooks, and my pens across the room. Papers scattered through the air like confetti. My favorite ceramic coffee mug shattered against the floor, spilling dark liquid across the wood. She grabbed a stack of federal compliance folders and ripped them in half, screaming that I was a selfish, ungrateful brat who owed my life to this family. The sheer physical aggression of her tantrum triggered a massive, immediate biological response in my body. The extreme stress and the sudden explosive adrenaline dump hit my system like a freight train. For a type 1 diabetic, an intense spike in cortisol and adrenaline can cause devastating, chaotic swings in blood sugar. I felt the terrifying familiar sensation wash over me instantly. My blood sugar began to crash rapidly. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across my forehead and the back of my neck. My knees suddenly felt like they were made of water, trembling so violently I had to grab the edge of my glass desk just to remain upright. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision darkening and blurring into a fuzzy gray tunnel. My continuous glucose monitor recognized the sudden dangerous plunge and started blaring its shrill, piercing emergency alarm from my arm. I could not breathe. My chest tightened as the severe hypoglycemia took hold, dragging my cognitive functions down with it. I needed to stabilize my blood sugar immediately. I needed the medical supplies sitting right on the marble counter of my open-plan kitchen just 10 feet away. I kept an emergency kit there precisely for moments of severe dysregulation, containing glucose syringes and my emergency insulin pen to manage the violent fluctuations once the crash rebounded. I let go of the desk and stumbled forward, gasping for air. Please, I wheezed, my voice barely a whisper as my legs threatened to give out completely. I need my medication. I need to get to the counter. I dragged my heavy, uncoordinated body toward the kitchen island, reaching my shaking hand out toward the small organizer where my life-saving supplies rested. But before my fingers could even graze the marble surface, Vanessa stepped directly into my path. She moved with deliberate, calculated cruelty, planting her designer boots firmly between me and the kitchen counter. I tried to push past her, desperate and suffocating, but she shoved me hard in the chest. The force of her push sent me staggering backward until I hit the edge of the living room sofa. I looked up at her, my vision swimming, expecting to see at least a flicker of sisterly concern or basic human decency. Instead, she stood tall, blocking my access to the counter, holding the collateral forms out toward me, with an absolutely ruthless, manic grin spreading across her face. Sign the papers, Riley, she demanded, watching me struggle to stay conscious. Sign the papers, and maybe I will let you have your little medicine. I tried to speak, but my throat was completely parched. The massive adrenaline dump from her violent entrance had triggered my liver to release a flood of glucose into my bloodstream. What had initially felt like a drop was actually a catastrophic vertical spike. My continuous monitor shrieked its high-pitched warning, a relentless sound that meant my levels were skyrocketing past safe limits. My blood was turning to thick syrup, and my cells were screaming for the one hormone my pancreas could not produce. Vanessa did not care about the alarm. She did not care about the sweat pouring down my face or the way my hands shook as I gripped the fabric of the sofa to keep from collapsing. She only cared about her husband's frozen bank accounts and her own lavish lifestyle. I cannot sign anything. I gasped, my chest heaving as my lungs struggled to pull in enough oxygen. I need my insulin. Please, Vanessa. Instead of stepping aside, my sister turned her back to me and casually walked over to the kitchen island. She picked up my medical organizer. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I watched her manicured fingers pull out the small glass vials of fast-acting insulin and my emergency backup pens. Leave them alone, I choked out, forcing my legs to push me away from the sofa. I took one unsteady step forward, but the room tilted violently. My legs gave way and I crashed hard onto the hardwood floor, my knees taking the brunt of the impact. Vanessa walked over to the stainless steel sink. She held the vials up to the light, inspecting them as if they were nothing more than cheap perfume. Then she looked down at me, her expression devoid of any human empathy. She twisted the cap off the first vial. "If I don't have diabetes, then you'll stay healthy too," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet mocking tone. "No," I begged, clutching my chest as the sharp acidic pain of diabetic ketoacidosis began to tear through my abdomen. My breathing became shallow and rapid. "Stop. Please, you are going to kill me." Vanessa just laughed. It was a cold, delighted sound that echoed off the high ceilings of my condo. She leaned over the sink and began pouring the clear liquid straight down the drain. The distinct medicinal smell of insulin filled the air, a scent that meant survival to me now, washing away into the city sewers. "You're sweating already," she taunted, watching me writhe on the floor. "What's your blood sugar?" 390. "How long until your organs shut down?" I did not say a word. I could not. The physical agony was becoming unbearable. Without insulin to unlock my cells, my body was rapidly breaking down its own fat for energy, flooding my bloodstream with toxic ketones. The metallic taste of acetone coated the back of my throat. My vision narrowed into a dark, fuzzy tunnel, leaving only Vanessa in sharp focus. She finished pouring out the last vial and dropped the empty glass into the sink with a hollow clatter. Then she picked up my emergency backup pens. She did not just throw them away. She dropped them onto the kitchen tiles, raised her heavy designer boot, and stomped down hard. The plastic casings cracked and shattered under her heel. The internal glass cartridges broke, pooling the last of my life-saving medication across the floor. I reached out a trembling hand, gasping for breath, desperately trying to drag myself toward the kitchen. Every muscle in my body felt like it was burning from the inside out. Vanessa stepped over the broken plastic and walked right past me. She paused by my glass desk, her eyes scanning the mess she had made earlier. She spotted my cell phone resting near the shattered remains of my coffee mug. She snatched it up and slipped it directly into her coat pocket. "You can have your phone back when you are ready to be a supportive sister and sign those collateral forms," she said, adjusting her coat as if she were simply leaving a disappointing business meeting. "Think about your priorities, Riley. Kendrick's investors are not going to wait forever." She walked to the front door. I lay paralyzed on the hardwood, my chest rising and falling in erratic, desperate heaves. The edges of my vision were going completely black. I watched helplessly as she stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy oak door shut. Then the most terrifying sound of all cut through the quiet apartment. The sharp, heavy click of the deadbolt locking from the outside. She had used her spare key to trap me inside. I was locked in. I had no phone. I had no insulin. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic, continuous shrieking of my glucose monitor. The alarm was warning me of impending organ failure, a biological countdown clock that I had no way of stopping. The intense abdominal pain doubled me over. I curled into a fetal position on the floor, shivering uncontrollably, despite the sweat soaking through my clothes. The toxic buildup of ketones in my blood was triggering a systemic shutdown. My heart raced, fluttering dangerously against my ribs as it struggled to pump the thickening blood through my veins. I tried to call out for help, hoping someone in the hallway might hear me, but only a ragged, dry gasp escaped my lips. The crushing weight of diabetic ketoacidosis was dragging me down into the dark. My mind grew sluggish, the thoughts slipping through my grasp like sand. I was going to die right here on my own living room floor, all because my family decided a real estate bailout was worth more than my life. As the final remnants of my strength faded away, my body went entirely limp against the cold wood. I refused to let my story end on this hardwood floor. The sheer injustice of Vanessa walking away to enjoy her stolen luxury, while my body shut down, ignited a tiny, fierce spark of pure rage deep within my chest. That anger acted like a defibrillator to my failing system. I forced my heavy eyelids open. The world around me was a muted, blurry gray, but I fixed my gaze on the sleek glass desk sitting just a few feet away. My smartwatch was resting on the edge of that desk. I had taken it off earlier because the metal band was pressing uncomfortably against my wrist while I was typing up my audit reports. I needed to reach it. It was my only lifeline. Every single movement was absolute agony. My muscles cramped and seized, starved of the energy they needed to function. I dug my fingernails into the grooves of the hardwood floor and pulled. My body felt like it was made of solid lead. I dragged my knees across the broken plastic of my destroyed insulin pens, not even feeling the sharp edges slicing into my skin. My breathing was ragged and deep, my lungs desperately trying to expel the toxic acid building up in my blood. I kept my eyes locked on the desk. I just needed to cross 5 feet of space. As I pulled myself forward inch by inch, a comforting thought cut through the dense, terrifying fog in my mind. Vanessa thought she had committed the perfect crime. She thought she could destroy my medication, lock me inside, and leave me to die without leaving a single trace of her involvement. She assumed my death would look like a tragic medical emergency, a sudden diabetic coma with no witnesses. She was incredibly wrong. Vanessa had no idea what my job truly required. I did not just check basic spreadsheets. I was a senior compliance auditor for a network that handled billions of dollars in federal healthcare funds. Because I worked remotely with highly classified financial data-sensitive patient records and federal tax information, my employer mandated draconian security protocols for my home office. 6 months ago, a corporate security team had come to my condo. They removed the standard smoke detector mounted on the ceiling directly above my workspace and replaced it with a custom state-of-the-art unit. Inside that discreet plastic shell was a motion-activated high-definition surveillance camera equipped with a crystal-clear audio recording system. The camera synced directly to a secure encrypted cloud server the moment it detected movement. That silent witness had been rolling since the exact second Vanessa shoved her way through my front door. It captured her manic entrance. It recorded her violently throwing my documents and shattering my mug. It caught the physical shove that sent me crashing into the sofa. And most importantly, it possessed pristine, undeniable footage of my sister intentionally pouring my life-saving insulin down the kitchen sink while laughing at my dying organs. Every cruel word, every mocking taunt, every stomp of her designer boot was permanently carved into a federal server. I just needed to stay alive long enough to use it. I finally reached the base of the glass desk. My heart was pounding so fast it felt like a continuous terrifying vibration in my chest. My vision was nearly gone, reduced to shadows and shapes. I reached my trembling, sweat-slicked hand up the cold metal leg of the desk. I fumbled blindly across the smooth glass surface. My fingers brushed against papers, knocking them to the floor until I finally felt the familiar metal casing of my smartwatch. I grabbed it and pulled it down to my chest. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely isolate my fingers. I found the side button. I pressed it down and held it. I counted the seconds in my head, fighting the overwhelming urge to just close my eyes and surrender to the darkness. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The watch vibrated sharply against my palm. A loud, robotic siren chirped from its small speaker, followed by an automated voice confirming that an SOS emergency alert had been broadcasted to local dispatch, transmitting my exact GPS coordinates and medical profile. I had done it. The device slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the floor beside me. The last ounce of adrenaline vanished, leaving me entirely empty. The pain in my abdomen faded into a strange, terrifying numbness. The heavy, dark weight of the ketoacidosis finally pulled me under, completely erasing the room, the sounds, and the pain. I do not know how much time passed while I lay unconscious. The timeline fractured into strange, disjointed sensory fragments. I remember a sound like a bomb going off. It was the violent, splintering crack of heavy wood giving way, the heavy oak frame of my front door being battered open. I remember the chaotic thud of heavy boots rushing across my hardwood floor. Bright, blinding beams of tactical flashlights swept across the dark room, piercing through my closed eyelids. I remember the sharp, urgent voices of strangers shouting medical terms above me. Someone called out my dangerously low respiratory rate. Someone else yelled about the scent of acetone in the air and the broken insulin pens scattered across the tiles. I felt strong hands rolling me onto a stretcher, lifting my limp body with practiced urgency. The harsh, jarring bumps of the gurney rolling down my hallway. The sudden blast of freezing Chicago winter air hitting my face as they rushed me out of the building. The deafening rhythmic wail of an ambulance siren tearing through the city streets. Then the world slipped away again, burying me in a deep, silent void as the paramedics fought desperately to keep my failing heart beating all the way to the emergency room. The transition from the dark void of diabetic ketoacidosis to the stark, terrifying reality of the intensive care unit was agonizingly slow. I became aware of my body in jagged, painful fragments. First came the rhythmic, persistent beeping of a cardiac monitor echoing in the sterile silence. Then the feeling of a nasal cannula blowing dry, cool oxygen directly into my nostrils. My throat felt like it was coated in crushed glass, and a heavy, dull ache throbbed deep within my veins, where multiple intravenous lines were pumping fluids and life-saving insulin back into my system. I was alive. My heart was still beating. Before I could even attempt to fully open my eyes, I heard the voices. They were hushed, dramatic, and dripping with absolute sickening falsehood. The sound sent an immediate sharp spike of adrenaline straight through my exhausted chest. I kept my eyelids heavy, opening them just a fraction of an inch to let in the harsh fluorescent light without drawing any attention to the fact that I had regained consciousness. Through the blur of my eyelashes, I saw the pristine white room. Standing at the foot of my hospital bed was an attending physician holding a digital tablet, his face etched with professional concern. Surrounding him, putting on the performance of an absolute lifetime, were my parents, Thomas and Brenda, and my sister, Vanessa. Vanessa was clutching a crumpled tissue to her face, her shoulders shaking with manufactured theatrical sobs. It was terrifyingly convincing. We just did not know how bad her depression had actually gotten. Dr. Vanessa cried, her voice trembling with perfect calibrated sorrow. I came over to check on her because she had not been answering our calls. When I used my emergency key to walk in, it was an absolute nightmare. She had completely snapped. The doctor spoke with the gentle, deeply sympathetic tone entirely falling for the malicious act. It is very common for patients dealing with severe chronic illnesses to experience massive burnout and major depressive episodes. But destroying her own medication in such a manner is an extreme manifestation of that distress. Destroying my own medication. The sheer audacity of the lie hit me like a physical blow, heavy and suffocating. Vanessa was actually spinning her cold-blooded attempted murder into a tragic, desperate suicide attempt. She was weaponizing my diabetes all over again, painting me as a fragile, broken woman who had finally cracked under the pressure of my own flawed pancreas. My mother stepped forward, resting a perfectly manicured hand on the doctor's white coat. She smashed her backup insulin pens right on the kitchen tiles, Brenda said, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. We found the glass vials poured entirely down the sink. We are just so incredibly thankful her medical alert smartwatch triggered when it did. If we had lost our little girl, I do not know how we would ever survive the guilt. Thomas folded his arms across his expensive designer wool coat, shaking his head with an expression of grim, heavy parental burden. Riley has been completely unhinged lately, he added, his voice carrying that familiar, authoritative weight. The stress of her corporate auditing job, living entirely alone in that big city, it has completely eroded her mental stability. She is entirely incapable of taking care of herself right now. We have tried to intervene in the past, but she becomes paranoid and deeply hostile. The physician nodded solemnly, tapping a note onto his digital screen. Given the severity of the incident and the intentional destruction of life-sustaining medication, we will need to place her on a mandatory psychiatric hold once she is medically stabilized. She cannot be discharged to live alone. She requires full-time supervision and a comprehensive psychological evaluation. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to sit up. I wanted to rip the intravenous lines right out of my arms, point a shaking finger at my sister, and scream the absolute truth to the physician. I wanted to tell him that the woman sobbing into a tissue had deliberately blocked my path, crushed my medication under her designer boot, and locked me inside my own home to die a slow, agonizing death. I wanted to expose them all right there in the intensive care unit. But my analytical mind, the very thing that made me a ruthless top-tier compliance auditor, clamped down hard on my rising panic. I evaluated the room like a crime scene. If I started screaming right now, what would the doctor actually see? He would see a severely ill patient, barely recovering from diabetic shock, experiencing extreme medical delirium. He would see exactly what my family had just meticulously described: an unstable, hostile, paranoid woman, making wild, impossible accusations against the devastated family members standing vigil by her bed. They had perfectly paved the way for any defense I mounted to look like sheer insanity. Protesting now would only validate their narrative and hand them the victory they so desperately craved. So I made the hardest, most agonizing choice of my entire life. I did absolutely nothing. I forced my tense muscles to relax into the thin hospital mattress. I kept my breathing slow, shallow, and perfectly even. I let my head loll slightly to the side against the stiff pillow, parting my lips just enough to let out a soft, incoherent groan, as if the heavy medical sedatives were keeping me entirely submerged in a deep, oblivious sleep. Through the narrowest slit of my vision, I watched Vanessa. The exact moment the doctor turned his back to check my vital signs on the cardiac monitor, the performance instantly dropped. The tearful, devastated sister vanished into thin air. A cold, vicious, triumphant smirk spread across Vanessa's face. She looked down at my seemingly unconscious body with a gaze full of pure malice. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had successfully neutralized the only threat to her husband's fraudulent empire and framed it as a personal tragedy. Thomas squeezed Vanessa's shoulder, a silent, approving gesture for a job flawlessly executed. Brenda pulled out her smartphone, immediately returning to her normal, callous self, scrolling through her business emails, while standing mere inches from her daughter's hospital bed. They were not a family standing vigil. They were a pack of predators securing their fresh kill, entirely confident that their prey was too weak to ever fight back. I lay there in the sterile, buzzing silence of the intensive care unit, feeling the cool fluid from the drip slide into my vein. They thought they had broken me. They thought that painting me as a suicidal, incompetent burden would silence me forever and clear their path to my assets. But they had made one massive, fatal miscalculation in their arrogant plan. By keeping my eyes closed, by playing the exact broken part they had written for me, I was giving them the absolute confidence to proceed with whatever horrific scheme they had planned next. And the more confident they felt, the more careless they would inevitably become. I would let them build their delicate house of cards as high as they wanted, right up until the exact moment I burned it all to the ground. The heavy wooden door to my ICU room clicked shut, leaving me alone in the dim, rhythmic glow of the medical monitors. I kept my breathing perfectly even, letting the sterile silence of the hospital wash over me. But the silence did not last long. My room was located right next to the nurses' station, and the walls in this wing were deceptively thin. Through the slight gap beneath the door, the muffled sounds of the hallway drifted in. I heard the unmistakable heavy tread of my father's leather shoes pacing the linoleum floor. Then a new voice joined the mix. It was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of the manufactured sympathy my parents had just displayed for the attending physician. I recognized that voice immediately. It belonged to Mitchell, the ruthless corporate attorney who handled the aggressive legal maneuvering for my parents' boutique medi-spa empire. He was not a family lawyer. He was a shark they called in when they needed to restructure assets or bury a messy lawsuit. The fact that Thomas had summoned him to the intensive care unit meant their plan was already moving into its next highly calculated phase. I strained to listen, keeping my body entirely motionless. The physician bought the narrative completely. Thomas said, his tone brisk and businesslike. He is filing the psychiatric hold paperwork as we speak. She is officially documented as a severe danger to herself, mentally unstable, and medically incapacitated. Excellent work, Mitchell replied, the rustle of papers echoing through the gap under the door. That is exactly what we need for the emergency petition. I have the preliminary conservatorship documents drafted. In the state of Illinois, when a patient is involuntarily committed under these specific severe psychiatric conditions, we can bypass the standard waiting period. We can approach a judge first thing tomorrow morning and secure a temporary ex parte guardianship. And that gives me full power of attorney. Thomas pressed his voice tight with impatience. Total financial and medical control, Mitchell confirmed. You will be legally appointed to manage her entire estate, her bank accounts, her investment portfolios, and most importantly, her real estate assets. She will not be able to sign a single contract or make a single withdrawal without your explicit authorization. Legally speaking, she will have the autonomy of a young child. I lay in the hospital bed, the cold reality of their scheme settling deep into my bones. A conservatorship. They were not just trying to steal my condo anymore. They were trying to completely erase my legal existence. They were using my sister's attempted murder to frame me as a suicidal, incompetent burden, manipulating the judicial system to strip away every ounce of my hard-earned independence. Vanessa chimed in, her voice stripped of all the fake tears she had weaponized just moments ago. It sounded sharp, greedy, and frantic. How fast can we liquidate the condo once the judge signs the order? Kendrick's investors are threatening to pull out by Friday. We cannot afford a standard 30-day closing process. We need the cash injected into his holding company immediately. We do not need to wait for a traditional sale. Thomas explained, his tone dripping with the cold arrogance of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone. Once I have the power of attorney, I will simply leverage the property. I have a private lender lined up who specializes in high-risk, high-yield bridge loans. We use Riley's condo as the primary collateral. The lender wires the funds directly to Kendrick's LLC within 48 hours. By the time Riley is discharged from her psychiatric evaluation, the money will already be washed through the construction accounts, and the condo will be encumbered with a massive, unbreakable lien. It was a breathtakingly malicious strategy. As a federal compliance auditor, my mind automatically mapped out the exact financial trail they were planning to create. They were going to plunge me into massive, insurmountable debt to save Kendrick's failing facade, and they were going to use the court system to make it perfectly legal. If I tried to fight the lien after the fact, I would be fighting as a legally documented, unstable woman attempting to overturn her appointed guardian's financial decisions. The burden of proof would be entirely on me, and I would be doing it without access to my own money to hire a lawyer. They thought they had engineered the perfect, inescapable trap. I need those papers ready for the judge the absolute second the courthouse opens, Thomas commanded. We are not leaving anything to chance. Keep her heavily sedated if you have to, he added, his voice fading slightly as they began to walk down the corridor. Just make sure she stays exactly where she is until the ink is dry on that court order. Their footsteps echoed away, leaving me alone with the steady, quiet hum of my cardiac monitor. A profound, chilling calm washed over me. I did not feel the crushing panic they intended for me to feel. I did not feel the despair of a woman trapped in an intensive care unit surrounded by predators. I felt the sharp, dangerous clarity of a professional auditor who had just been handed the entire blueprint of a criminal conspiracy. They needed me to be broken. They needed me to be a helpless, silent victim completely dependent on their fabricated mercy. I knew that the slightest sign of resistance right now would ruin everything. If I demanded a lawyer, if I screamed about the security camera in my apartment, they would scramble to destroy the evidence before I could secure it. They would change their tactics, hire better defense attorneys, and drag me into a brutal, protracted legal war. I could not let them change their strategy. I had to let them walk willingly into the snare they had set for me. A nurse quietly pushed open the door to check my intravenous lines. I let my head roll toward her, blinking slowly, letting my eyes appear glassy and vacant. I offered no resistance as she adjusted the blood pressure cuff on my arm. I breathed softly, staring blankly at the ceiling, playing the part of the shattered, incompetent daughter, to absolute perfection. I stayed entirely silent, locking my fury deep inside, preparing to let my family build their fraudulent case right up to the edge of the cliff. The hospital quieted down as the night shift took over. The heavy footsteps of my parents and their ruthless lawyer had long faded away. I needed internet access, and I needed it immediately. When the night nurse came in to check my vitals around 2 in the morning, I saw my opportunity. Her name tag read Brittany. I put on my best, most vulnerable voice, letting a single pathetic tear slip down my cheek. I explained that I was terrified, unable to sleep, and just wanted to watch a comforting movie to distract myself from the overwhelming depression they all believed I was suffering from. Brittany, bless her deeply empathetic heart, handed me her personal tablet with a warm smile and promised to leave me undisturbed for the next few hours. The blue light of this borrowed tablet cast a harsh glow across my hospital blankets as I pulled up the encrypted portal for my firm. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, bypassing the standard two-factor authentication protocols using my senior clearance overrides. I had spent years analyzing the financial lifeblood of the American healthcare system, tracking diverted funds, and prosecuting corporate embezzlement. I knew exactly where to look and precisely how to break down the corporate veils my family thought were impenetrable. I started with Thomas and Brenda. I typed the primary tax identification numbers for their boutique medi-spa empire into the federal database. The system churned for a fraction of a second before populating the screen with thousands of rows of billing codes, insurance claims, and Medicare disbursements. At first glance, it looked like a highly successful, aggressively expanding medical aesthetic business. But I was not a casual observer. I was a forensic auditor. I ran a comparative algorithm, matching their patient volume against their supply chain invoices. The discrepancy hit me like a physical blow. The numbers were mathematically impossible. Thomas and Brenda were ordering enough raw medical supplies to treat maybe 50 patients a week, but they were billing the federal government for over 500. I dug deeper into the specific procedural codes. They were running a textbook phantom billing operation. They had somehow acquired a massive list of valid Medicare identification numbers and were submitting claims for patients who had never even set foot inside their pristine marble-lined clinics. Furthermore, they were upcoding the few legitimate procedures they actually performed. A basic out-of-pocket dermatology consultation for a wealthy client was being illegally coded and billed to the government as complex reconstructive surgery. They were bleeding millions of dollars directly from federal funds. But stealing the money was only the first step of a criminal enterprise. Healthcare fraud generates a massive amount of incredibly dirty capital. You cannot just deposit millions of stolen government dollars into a personal checking account and buy a $90,000 luxury SUV without triggering a massive federal investigation. The money had to be cleaned. It had to be washed through a seemingly legitimate enterprise. I opened a second secure tab and ran a backdoor query on Kendrick. My brother-in-law had always projected the image of a self-made real estate mogul. He wore custom suits, drove imported cars, and constantly talked about his aggressive expansion into commercial development. I pulled up the public property records and financial disclosures for his various limited liability companies. He owned dozens of empty lots and half-finished construction sites scattered across the city. On paper, his business looked like a poorly managed, over-leveraged disaster. But when I cross-referenced the deposit timestamps from his holding companies with the payout dates from my parents' medi-spa accounts, the true architecture of their syndicate revealed itself. The correlation was flawless. Every single time Thomas and Brenda received a massive fraudulent payout from Medicare, Kendrick's construction firms mysteriously received a massive influx of private investor capital. They were funneling the stolen healthcare money directly into his real estate developments. Kendrick would generate fake invoices for building materials, architectural fees, and contractor labor using the dirty money to pay off shell companies that he also controlled. The funds would then be deposited into his primary accounts as clean, legitimate real estate revenue. It was a classic, highly orchestrated layering operation. They were laundering the federal money right out in the open. So why was Kendrick suddenly desperate enough to demand my condo? Why would a family running a multi-million-dollar racket need to extort a single diabetic woman for a bridge loan? I accessed the restricted federal flagging system, searching for any active holds on Kendrick's primary business accounts. The screen refreshed, and the answer stared back at me in stark red text. An automated Internal Revenue Service algorithm had caught a minor, seemingly insignificant discrepancy in one of Kendrick's shell company tax returns 3 weeks ago. That single anomaly had triggered an automatic systemic freeze on all his connected financial assets, pending a routine audit. The banking institutions had locked down every cent of their laundered money. Kendrick, Vanessa, Thomas, and Brenda were entirely cut off from their stolen fortune. The house of cards was collapsing. They had contractors demanding payment, luxury car leases coming due, and commercial mortgages defaulting. They needed clean, untraceable capital immediately to keep the illusion alive and pay off their immediate debts before the federal auditors decided to dig deeper. They could not go to a traditional bank for a loan, because a bank would require a deep dive into their currently frozen finances. They needed a hard money private lender, and a private lender required a clean, unencumbered, high-value asset as collateral. They needed my home. I sat back against the stiff hospital pillows, my heart hammering a fierce, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. Vanessa did not try to kill me out of pure spite. She tried to kill me because I was the only obstacle standing between her and a federal prison sentence. They needed me legally incapacitated or dead, so Thomas could seize power of attorney and liquidate my assets to save their criminal empire. I looked down at the tablet in my hands. I did not just have a video of my sister committing attempted murder. I held the cryptographic key to a massive racketeer-influenced and corrupt Organizations Act conspiracy. I had the exact financial trail required to dismantle their entire lives and hand them over to the federal government on a silver platter. I cleared the search history, wiped the secure tunnel protocols from the device, and set it on the bedside table. My family thought they were playing a game of real estate extortion with a weak, broken woman. They had no idea they had just invited a federal compliance auditor to review their murder plot. The morning light filtering into the intensive care unit signaled the beginning of my performance. The attending physician arrived shortly after breakfast to sign my official discharge papers. Because of the fabricated suicide narrative my family had expertly spun, combined with the emergency conservatorship petition Thomas had already filed with the court, I was completely stripped of my basic civil rights. I was legally barred from leaving the hospital on my own accord. I was formally released directly into the suffocating custody of my parents. I sat in the back of a hospital wheelchair as a nurse rolled me down the long, sterile corridor toward the exit. Thomas and Brenda walked a few paces ahead, not once looking back to see how I was holding up. When we reached Thomas's imported luxury sedan, I practically dragged myself into the back seat. I let my shoulders slump forward and allowed my jaw to go slightly slack. I kept my eyes fixed blankly on the floor mats. I needed them to believe the sheer trauma of the diabetic ketoacidosis and the heavy hospital sedatives had completely shattered my cognitive function. I needed to look like a woman who had given up the fight. The car ride to my downtown Chicago condo was suffocatingly quiet. Brenda sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone and occasionally sighing in loud, exaggerated annoyance, as if keeping her own daughter alive was a terrible inconvenience to her daily schedule. When we finally arrived at my building, the power dynamic shifted entirely. Thomas did not treat me like a patient recovering from a near-fatal medical emergency. He treated me like a newly processed inmate, arriving at a minimum security prison. The moment we walked through my front door, Thomas held out his hand and demanded my building access fob and my house keys. I fumbled in my purse with deliberately shaking fingers and handed them over without a single word of protest. He pocketed them immediately, effectively trapping me inside my own home. Brenda marched straight into my kitchen and began aggressively throwing away my groceries, tossing perfectly good food into the trash, while loudly declaring that I clearly lacked the mental capacity to manage a proper diabetic diet anymore. I shuffled into the living room and collapsed onto the sofa, the exact spot where Vanessa had left me to die just days earlier. I stared vacantly at the shattered plastic of my crushed insulin pens, which were still scattered across the kitchen tiles. Brenda had not even bothered to sweep them up. I pulled my knees to my chest and wrapped my arms around myself, shivering slightly. Thomas walked over and stood directly in front of the sofa, towering over me to establish sheer physical dominance. He looked down with a gaze full of pure, unfiltered disdain. "You have caused a massive disruption to this family, Riley," he said, his voice cold and commanding. Your little mental breakdown has cost me valuable time and resources. You are incredibly lucky your mother and I are willing to step in and take control of your messy, pathetic life. Most parents would have let you rot in a state facility. I forced a few genuine tears to prick the corners of my eyes. I looked up at him, letting my lower lip tremble. I am sorry, I whispered, keeping my voice raspy and weak. I am just so tired. I do not know what is wrong with me. Brenda laughed from the kitchen, a short, sharp sound of absolute mockery. What is wrong with you is that you are weak, Riley. You have always been weak. Now sit there and stay quiet. We have real business to handle today. I lowered my head back down, hiding the cold, dangerous smile that threatened to break across my face. They were buying the act completely. Their arrogant, narcissistic belief in their own superiority blinded them to the fact that they were sharing a room with a federal compliance auditor who had just mapped out their entire criminal syndicate. Early that afternoon, the doorbell rang. Thomas answered it, ushering in Mitchell, their ruthless corporate attorney. Mitchell walked into my sanctuary carrying a thick leather briefcase and a smug, confident expression. He did not even look at me. He walked straight to my glass dining table and spread out a thick stack of preliminary legal disclosures and financial waivers. These were the specific consent forms required to fast-track the conservatorship hearing and expedite the massive real estate lien they planned to place on my home. Thomas walked over to the sofa, grabbed me roughly by the upper arm, and pulled me to my feet. He marched me over to the dining table and forced me to sit in one of the chairs. He pulled a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket and shoved it into my trembling hand. "Sign exactly where Mitchell points," Thomas commanded, tapping a heavy finger against the pristine white paper. "Do not try to read them. Your brain is not working right anyway, and we do not have time for you to pretend to understand complex legal documents. Just sign your name." Mitchell flipped to the last page of the first document and pointed a manicured finger at the blank signature line. I picked up the fountain pen with a clumsy, awkward grip. I let my hand shake violently. I took a deep, shuddering breath, letting a single tear fall directly onto the signature block, smudging the ink slightly. Then I signed my name, but I did not use my actual signature. For 10 years, I had signed thousands of highly classified federal documents. My legal signature was a very specific, sharp, highly stylized script registered with government agencies. For these fraudulent family documents, I did something entirely different. I deliberately misspelled my own middle name. I looped the letters backward, applied uneven pressure, and dragged the pen heavily at the end of the stroke, making it look like the erratic, uncontrolled scribble of a heavily sedated, legally incompetent woman. As an auditor, I knew exactly how the judicial system functioned. I knew that any basic handwriting analysis in a federal court would instantly flag this signature as invalid, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the documents were signed under severe duress and absolute medical incapacitation. I was planting landmines directly into their legal foundation. I went through the entire stack, repeating the exact same flawed, shaky signature on every single page. When I reached the final document, I let the pen slip from my fingers, letting it clatter loudly against the glass table. I slumped forward, burying my face in my hands, as if the simple act of writing had completely drained my remaining life force. Thomas snatched the papers off the table with a greedy, triumphant smirk. He quickly flipped through the pages, seeing ink on every line, completely oblivious to the fatal trap hidden in the handwriting. He handed the stack to Mitchell. "Everything is perfectly in order," Mitchell said, sliding the documents back into his leather briefcase. "With these signed waivers, the judge will have zero hesitation granting the temporary conservatorship tomorrow morning. I will notify Kendrick that the bridge loan can be processed the absolute second the judge drops the gavel." "Excellent," Thomas replied, clapping the lawyer on the shoulder. "Let us get this done." Mitchell left the apartment, and Thomas turned back to me looking entirely satisfied with his stolen victory. He told me to go to my bedroom and stay there until they needed me for court. I stood up slowly, shuffling down the hallway like a defeated prisoner. I closed my bedroom door behind me and sat on the edge of my mattress. They thought they had chained me down and stolen my future. They did not realize I had just handed them a forged rope to hang themselves with. I spent the rest of that evening sitting on the edge of my mattress, listening to the suffocating silence of my own hijacked apartment. Thomas had stripped me of my keys and my building access, but his arrogant assumption of my incompetence meant he had not bothered to search my bedroom. He did not know that a senior compliance auditor never relies on just one layer of security. Hidden inside the false bottom of my jewelry box was a high-fidelity battery-operated digital audio recorder standard-issue equipment for conducting hostile corporate field audits. I pulled it out, tested the battery life, and slipped it deep into the oversized pocket of the thick gray cardigan I was wearing. The next afternoon, the heavy deadbolt on my front door clicked open. I heard the sharp, aggressive clatter of Vanessa's designer stiletto heels striking the hardwood floor. She was not alone. A man's voice, slick and professional, echoed down the hallway. I shuffled out of my bedroom, dragging my feet and keeping my shoulders hunched, playing the heavily sedated patient to absolute perfection. Vanessa stood in the center of my living room. She was wearing a tailored white blazer and a triumphant smile. Beside her stood a man holding a laser measuring device and a sleek leather folio. He was a high-end commercial real estate broker. "Oh, Riley, sweetheart," Vanessa cooed, her voice dripping with a sickly manufactured sweetness as soon as I entered the room. "I brought someone to help us figure out the floor plan. We need to start packing up your personal things today. I know this transition is overwhelming, but moving to a specialized facility is truly what is best for your mental health." The broker gave me a brief, deeply uncomfortable look of pity before turning his attention back to the architecture. He did not see a successful professional standing in her own hard-earned home. He saw a broken, tragic woman who could no longer care for herself. He walked through my kitchen, sweeping his laser pointer across the custom marble island and the high ceilings. He praised the natural light and the premium location, casually discussing how quickly they could secure an appraisal to satisfy a private bridge lender. He suggested clearing out my medical organizer and my personal photographs to properly stage the condo for a rapid valuation. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply curled myself into the corner of my velvet armchair, pulling my thick cardigan tightly around my chest. My thumb rested silently inside my pocket, pressing the small record button on the hidden audio device. A tiny vibration confirmed the microphone was live and capturing every single word. For 45 agonizing minutes, I sat completely still while Vanessa and the broker treated my home like a foreclosed property. When the broker finally finished his aggressive appraisal, he assured Vanessa that the valuation report would be expedited directly to Kendrick's holding company by the end of the business day. He packed up his equipment and let himself out, closing the heavy front door behind him. The absolute second the latch clicked shut, the loving, concerned sister vanished into thin air. Vanessa dropped the sweet smile. Her posture shifted from maternal care to cold, predatory arrogance. She walked over to my velvet armchair and stood directly over me, forcing me to look up at her. She crossed her arms, looking around my pristine living room with a gaze full of sheer, unadulterated greed. "You really outdid yourself with this place, Riley," Vanessa said, her voice dropping its fake warmth. "The location, the finishes, it is almost a shame we have to leverage it to the absolute breaking point. But Kendrick needs the capital to unfreeze his project accounts, and your little domestic sanctuary is going to provide the perfect influx of clean cash." I kept my face entirely slack, offering only a vague, vacant smile. "It is cold in here," I mumbled, letting my voice waver and crack, playing the role of the heavily medicated victim. Vanessa laughed. It was the exact same cruel, delighted laugh I had heard right before she poured my life-saving insulin down the kitchen sink. "You are not going to have to worry about the temperature here for much longer," she taunted, leaning in close so I could smell her expensive perfume. "Enjoy the view while it lasts. By this time next week, the judge is going to stamp that conservatorship order. Dad is going to have total, unquestionable legal control over every single asset attached to your name. This condo, your bank accounts, your investment portfolios, it all gets handed directly to us." I blinked slowly, letting my head tilt to the side as if I could barely process her words. "And the best part," Vanessa whispered, her eyes shining with pure malice, "is where you are going to be living while we spend your money. Dad found the perfect assisted living facility for you out in the suburbs. It is a locked-down psychiatric ward for patients who are a danger to themselves They restrict internet access, they monitor all phone calls, and they drug you up so much you will not even remember what day it is. You are going to rot in a linoleum room surrounded by people who cannot even feed themselves, and the court is going to thank us for being such a responsible, loving family." She reached down and patted my cheek with a condescending, humiliating slap. "You should have just signed the papers at the steakhouse, Riley. You could have saved yourself all this trouble. Now Kendrick gets his money, I get my lifestyle back, and you get absolutely erased from society. You are a ghost on paper, and nobody is ever going to believe a word you say." I did not flinch. I did not break character. I just kept that vague, empty smile plastered on my face, staring through her. I knew that resting securely inside my pocket was a high-definition audio recording of her explicitly outlining a premeditated criminal conspiracy to commit financial fraud, elder abuse, and false imprisonment. She was arrogant enough to confess to the entire operation because she was absolutely certain I was powerless to stop it. Vanessa grabbed her designer handbag from the kitchen counter and walked toward the front door. She did not bother looking back at me as she stepped out into the hallway and locked the deadbolt from the outside. The moment the apartment fell silent, the vacant smile dropped from my face. My posture straightened. I pulled the digital recorder from my pocket, stopped the capture, and immediately uploaded the pristine audio file to my secure federal cloud server. Vanessa thought she was packing up my life. She had no idea she had just handed me the final, irrefutable piece of evidence required to lock her and her husband in a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. The next morning, my father drove me to my first mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Thomas had insisted on personally escorting me to the appointment to ensure I did not try anything foolish. The drive to the clinic was suffocating. Thomas spent the entire commute lecturing me about how much money my temporary insanity was costing him. He complained about the inconvenience of acting as my legal guardian and reminded me that once the judge signed the final order tomorrow, my entire existence would be managed by his private accountant. I just stared at the passing traffic, letting his arrogant monologues wash over me. He needed this court-ordered therapy session on the official record to prove to the judge that I was under active psychiatric care and entirely incapable of managing my own affairs. When we pulled up to the sprawling medical complex, Thomas walked me directly to the front desk of the behavioral health wing. He told the receptionist he would be waiting right there in the main lobby. I shuffled down the corridor alongside a medical assistant, keeping my shoulders slumped and my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. But the absolute moment the heavy double doors of the counseling center clicked shut behind me, the broken victim routine evaporated entirely. I straightened my posture and walked straight past the therapist's office. This particular medical complex had a secondary exit leading down to a subterranean parking garage. My firm had arranged this specific location for a highly strategic reason. I pushed through the concrete stairwell doors and descended to the second sublevel. A sleek black sport utility vehicle was waiting in the shadows with the engine running. The back door swung open and I stepped inside. Sitting across from me were two of the most ruthless corporate compliance attorneys from my healthcare network, alongside 3 agents from a specialized federal financial crimes task force. I knew these lawyers well. They were the apex predators of the corporate auditing world, the exact people you call when a billion-dollar hospital system needs to surgically remove a financial parasite. The lead federal investigator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman introduced as Special Agent Foster, handed me a sealed digital tablet. "You said you had something urgent," Foster said, her eyes scanning my face with professional intensity. "Your firm vouched for you, Riley, but bringing a federal task force out to a parking garage requires substantial justification." I did not waste time with small talk. I took the tablet, accessed my encrypted cloud server, and pulled up the forensic audit I had compiled from my hospital bed in the intensive care unit. I turned the bright screen toward the agents and the corporate lawyers. "I am handing you a fully documented Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act conspiracy," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "Thomas and Brenda are billing the federal government for phantom medical procedures through their medi clinics. They are upcoding basic consultations as major reconstructive surgeries and siphoning millions in Medicare funds. But they are not holding the cash themselves. They are laundering every single cent of it through Kendrick. I pulled up the cross-referenced public property records and the digital deposit timestamps. I showed the federal agents exactly how Kendrick was using his failing real estate development limited liability companies to wash the stolen healthcare money. I pointed out the fake invoices for construction materials and architectural fees. I explained that the Internal Revenue Service had just frozen Kendrick's accounts over a minor discrepancy, which was why the entire syndicate was currently in full panic mode. The corporate attorneys leaned in, their eyes widening as they reviewed the flawless, mathematically undeniable paper trail. Agent Foster stared at the data, a look of profound respect crossing her face. "You built a federal indictment from a hospital bed," she noted, scrolling through the extensive financial web. "This is bulletproof. But why the rush on the conservatorship? Why are they trying to lock you away today?" "Because they need clean capital to unfreeze their assets and flee the jurisdiction," I explained. "They want the judge to grant Thomas full power of attorney tomorrow morning so they can leverage my downtown condo for an emergency bridge loan. But that is only half of the story." I opened the secondary secure file. I tapped the screen and started the high-definition security footage from my home office. The interior of the sport utility vehicle went dead silent. The federal prosecutors and the seasoned agents watched in absolute shock as the video played. They heard the crystal-clear audio of my sister Vanessa laughing as she poured my life-saving insulin down the kitchen sink. They watched her violently crush my backup medication under her heavy designer boot, while I writhed on the floor in the background, slipping rapidly into diabetic ketoacidosis. They heard her mock my failing organs and watched her lock the front door from the outside, intentionally leaving me trapped to die a slow, agonizing death. When the video ended, the heavy silence in the vehicle was thick with sheer disbelief. One of the corporate lawyers actually had to look away, physically sickened by the raw brutality of what he had just witnessed. Agent Foster slowly closed the tablet. Her expression had shifted from professional curiosity to absolute ice-cold fury. "This is not just a financial crime anymore," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This is attempted murder for financial gain. We have enough evidence right here to raid their homes and arrest every single one of them by noon." "No," I said firmly. "If you arrest them now, their defense attorneys will spin the narrative. They will claim Vanessa acted alone in a moment of panic. They will try to separate the financial fraud from the attempted murder. We need to tie the entire conspiracy together in front of a judge." Foster tilted her head, listening closely. "What do you have in mind?" "They are going to family court tomorrow morning to petition for full control over my life," I explained. "They are going to stand in front of a judge and present fabricated psychological evaluations claiming I tried to commit suicide. They are going to commit blatant perjury on the public record to facilitate a massive financial crime. I want you to let them do it. I want them to walk into that courtroom feeling absolutely untouchable." A slow, calculating smile spread across Agent Foster's face. "You want to spring the trap while they are all grouped together under oath." "Exactly," I said. "We let them present their entire fraudulent case to the judge. We let them put their lies on the official court record. And then we introduce the video. We let the judge see exactly what they did to me. When their entire legal strategy collapses in real time, the task force walks through the doors and arrests the whole syndicate." The federal agents exchanged approving glances. It was a flawless tactical maneuver. By allowing my family to commit perjury in open court, we were adding another layer of federal charges to their indictment and ensuring they had absolutely no room to negotiate a plea deal. The trap was set. I spent another 40 minutes finalizing the logistical details with the task force. Agent Foster assured me that a specialized federal prosecutor would be waiting in the courtroom to represent me when the time came. With the plan firmly in place, I wiped the tablet, exited the vehicle, and slipped back up the concrete stairwell. I walked back into the behavioral health lobby exactly 50 minutes after I had arrived, keeping my shoulders slumped and my eyes vacant. Thomas was sitting in the waiting area, checking his expensive watch with an annoyed expression. He stood up as I approached, grabbing my arm roughly to guide me out the door. He had absolutely no idea that the broken, docile daughter he was dragging back to his car had just handed his entire life over to the federal government. The drive back to my condo from the behavioral health clinic was a masterclass in psychological endurance. Thomas gripped the steering wheel of his luxury sedan, humming a cheerful, upbeat tune. He occasionally glanced at me in the rearview mirror with a look of pure predatory satisfaction. He truly believed he had successfully completed the final mandatory hurdle. I kept my head resting against the cool glass of the window, staring blankly at the Chicago skyline passing by. I let my jaw remain slack. I let my hands rest limply in my lap. I was the perfect picture of a defeated, heavily medicated woman who had completely surrendered to her fate. He had absolutely no idea that the silent passenger in his back seat had just triggered a massive federal avalanche that was currently barreling directly toward his carefully constructed criminal empire. When we finally walked through my front door, the overwhelming scent of roasted garlic and expensive truffles hit me instantly. Brenda, Vanessa, and Kendrick had completely taken over my home. They were treating my condo like a conquered territory. The dining table, the very same glass table where they had forced me to sign those forged conservatorship waivers, was now set for an extravagant multi-course feast. They had ordered in from a Michelin-starred restaurant down the street, charging the exorbitant bill to a credit card they fully intended to pay off using the equity they planned to steal from me tomorrow morning. Kendrick stood by the kitchen island pouring generous measures of top-shelf bourbon into crystal glasses. He wore a custom-tailored suit looking every bit the high-rolling real estate mogul he pretended to be. He flashed a brilliant, arrogant smile as Thomas walked into the room. "The final hurdle is cleared," Thomas announced, taking off his wool coat and draping it casually over my velvet armchair. "The psychiatric evaluation is officially on the record. The judge has everything required to stamp the ex parte guardianship order the absolute second the courthouse opens." Kendrick raised his glass in a triumphant toast, the amber liquid catching the light from the overhead chandelier. "To the family legacy," he declared, his deep voice echoing through my living room, "and to overcoming temporary liquidity issues with strategic, decisive action." Vanessa walked out of my kitchen carrying a silver platter of prime rib. She was wearing a silk slip dress, looking completely relaxed and victorious. She set the heavy platter down and turned her cold, calculating eyes toward me. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of absolute disgust. "Sit down, Riley," Vanessa commanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the smallest chair at the very corner of the table. "Try not to make a mess. We are celebrating, and we do not have the patience to deal with one of your pathetic medical episodes tonight." I shuffled over to the table with slow, dragged footsteps. I pulled out the chair and sat down, keeping my shoulders hunched forward. Brenda had prepared a separate, incredibly bland plate of plain steamed vegetables and boiled chicken for me, treating me like an infant who could not be trusted with a proper meal. She placed a cloth napkin roughly onto my lap, giving my shoulder a condescending pat. "Eat your vegetables," Riley, Brenda said, her tone dripping with fake saccharine maternal care. "You need to keep your strength up for the transition. The assisted living facility has a very strict dietary schedule, and we want you to be fully prepared for your new routine." I picked up my fork with trembling fingers and took a small, quiet bite. I chewed slowly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on my plate. I let the sound of their arrogant, booming conversation wash over me. Kendrick dominated the dinner table. He leaned back in his chair, cutting into his prime rib, while boasting loudly about his massive upcoming commercial ventures. He talked about a new high-rise development he planned to break ground on by the end of the month. He enthusiastically detailed the millions of dollars in private capital he was about to inject into the project, blissfully unaware that the federal compliance attorneys and the specialized task force had already mapped out every single one of his shell companies. He bragged about his brilliant financial maneuvering, completely oblivious to the fact that the money he was waiting for was inextricably tied to the Medicare fraud ring and that the federal net had already closed tightly around his neck. Thomas and Brenda were equally unhinged in their arrogance. They cheerfully discussed expanding their boutique medi spa empire into 2 neighboring states. Brenda talked about hiring new aesthetic nurses and opening lavish new storefronts, completely ignoring the fact that their entire business model was built on billing the federal government for phantom reconstructive surgeries. They were drinking expensive wine, laughing loudly, and dividing up my stolen assets before the judge had even seen the paperwork. They were celebrating their absolute immunity. They truly believed that because they wore designer clothes and drove luxury cars, the rules of society simply did not apply to them. They believed they could crush my medication, lock me in a room to die, forge my medical records, and walk away richer than ever. I sat in the corner eating my bland vegetables, watching them gorge themselves on their stolen victory. The contrast between their booming, arrogant laughter and the cold, hard reality of the federal indictment waiting for them tomorrow morning was almost poetic. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel betrayed. I just felt the icy, calculating precision of a predator watching its prey step willingly into an inescapable trap. As the dinner finally began to wind down, Kendrick pushed his empty plate away and checked his heavy gold watch. "We should all get some rest," he announced, smiling broadly at Vanessa. "Tomorrow is a massive day. The bank is ready to process the bridge loan the moment we transmit the court order." Vanessa clapped her hands together in sheer delight. "I have an appointment with a personal shopper at noon to celebrate," she said, her eyes gleaming with greed. "We are finally getting our lives back on track." I carefully placed my fork down on my plate. I reached up and pulled the cloth napkin from my lap, folding it with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I placed it perfectly on the glass table. Then I let the hunched, defeated posture slip away just a fraction of an inch. I sat up a little straighter. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I turned my head and looked directly at Vanessa. I dropped the vacant, heavily medicated stare. I met her eyes with a gaze so sharp, so cold, and so undeniably lucid that she actually stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Her triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a sudden flashing instinct of primal confusion. I stood up from the table, my movements smooth and completely controlled. I looked down at my sister, letting a chilling, razor-sharp smile form on my lips. "Make sure you wear your best dress to court tomorrow," I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the silence of the dining room like a surgical blade. "It is going to be quite a show." I did not wait for her to respond. I turned my back on the stunned, silent table and walked down the hallway to my bedroom, my footsteps steady and strong. I closed my door, listening to the sudden heavy silence radiating from the dining room, knowing that tomorrow their entire world was going to violently end. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold, biting wind sweeping off Lake Michigan. Thomas knocked sharply on my bedroom door, ordering me to get dressed in something respectable but deliberately plain. I chose an oversized, dull gray sweater and simple, dark slacks, actively cultivating the image of a woman who had entirely given up on herself. My family, however, had dressed for a coronation. When I walked into the living room, Kendrick was adjusting a heavy diamond tie clip, and Vanessa was smoothing the skirt of a flawless, incredibly expensive designer dress, taking my ominous advice from the night before completely to heart. Brenda wore a pristine white pantsuit, looking every bit the concerned, affluent matriarch. Thomas checked his luxury watch, herding us all toward the front door with an air of absolute invincible confidence. The downtown family courthouse was a sprawling building of cold marble and echoing hallways. Walking through the security checkpoints, my family commanded the space. They moved as a single, impenetrable unit of wealth and privilege, completely ignoring the other families navigating their own tragedies in the corridors. Thomas kept a firm, controlling grip on my elbow, physically steering me down the hall toward our assigned courtroom. He wanted to make sure I did not have a sudden moment of lucidity and attempt to speak to a court officer or a passing security guard. I kept my gaze firmly fixed on the polished floor tiles, dragging my feet just enough to maintain the illusion of heavy medical sedation. We took our places inside the austere, wood-paneled courtroom. The heavy benches creaked as we sat. Thomas and Brenda positioned themselves securely at the petitioner table, flanked by Mitchell, their sharply dressed corporate shark of an attorney. Kendrick sat in the front row of the gallery right behind them, radiating arrogant boredom. I was directed to sit at the respondent table on the opposite side of the aisle, isolated and seemingly defenseless. Vanessa chose a gallery seat perfectly aligned with my line of sight. She crossed her legs, resting her designer handbag on her lap, and offered me a smile so toxic and self-satisfied it could have poisoned water. She thought she was watching the final nail being driven into my coffin. The bailiff called the room to order and the judge took the bench. He was an older man with a stern face and a reputation for prioritizing aggressive family intervention in mental health crises. Mitchell did not waste a single second. He stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and approached the podium with the smooth, practiced grace of a man who manipulated the law for a living. Mitchell began to weave a masterpiece of absolute perjury. He spoke with a somber, deeply serious tone, presenting a thick binder of documents to the judge. He claimed these were comprehensive psychological evaluations, hospital intake forms, and medical records detailing my rapid, catastrophic mental decline. He painted a tragic, heartbreaking picture of a successful corporate auditor who had completely cracked under the intense pressure of her career and the isolation of city life. He described me as a severe, immediate danger to myself. With a straight face, Mitchell recounted the fabricated story of how I had suffered a massive psychotic break. He told the judge that I had intentionally destroyed my own life-saving insulin and crushed my backup medication in a desperate, unhinged bid to end my own life. As he spoke, Brenda dutifully pulled a tissue from her purse, dabbing at her dry eyes and letting out a soft, rehearsed sniffle. Thomas placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, playing the role of the devastated, loving father trying to save his broken daughter. Mitchell continued his performance, praising my parents to the ceiling. He described Thomas and Brenda as dedicated guardians who had rushed to my side, desperately trying to protect me from my own self-destructive impulses. He portrayed Kendrick and Vanessa as a pillar of support, claiming they had put their own lives on hold to manage my crisis. He explicitly told the judge that without immediate total intervention, I would inevitably attempt to take my own life again. He wielded my diabetes not as a chronic illness, but as a loaded weapon, arguing that my medical non-compliance was absolute, undeniable proof of my mental incompetence. Then came the final, devastating request. Mitchell looked the judge square in the eye and formally petitioned the court to grant Thomas immediate total conservatorship. He requested absolute power of attorney over my entire estate, my bank accounts, my real estate assets, and my medical decisions. He specifically asked the judge to waive any standard waiting periods or secondary psychological evaluations, citing my supposed suicide attempt as an extreme, life-threatening emergency. He argued that Thomas needed immediate financial control to secure proper full-time psychiatric care for me, masking their plan to liquidate my condo behind a veil of medical necessity. The courtroom fell silent as the judge adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the fraudulent documents Mitchell had handed him. Across the aisle, Vanessa leaned forward slightly. She caught my eye and offered a slow, deliberate, mocking smirk. It was a look of pure, unadulterated victory. She was celebrating the imminent theft of my home, the total erasure of my independence, and the millions of dollars they were about to launder through my stolen equity. She truly believed she had won the game and outsmarted everyone in the room. She had absolutely no idea that the pristine, confident facade she was projecting was about to be utterly annihilated, or that the federal government was already waiting in the wings to tear her perfect life apart. The judge adjusted his heavy black robes and looked down from the elevated bench, his expression etched with a mixture of bureaucratic fatigue and misplaced pity. He had swallowed every single lie Mitchell had just expertly delivered. He looked directly at my side of the aisle, seeing only a hunched, defeated woman drowning in an oversized gray sweater. "Miss Riley," the judge said, his voice echoing through the silent, wood-paneled room, "the court is in receipt of this emergency petition for temporary guardianship. Given the severe medical incident detailed in these affidavits, I must ask if you comprehend the nature of these proceedings. Do you currently have legal representation present to speak on your behalf?" I kept my head bowed. I let a heavy, terrifying silence stretch across the courtroom. I could feel Thomas and Brenda holding their collective breath, waiting for me to seal my own fate with a mumbled, incoherent surrender. I could feel Vanessa practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. I did not answer the judge. I simply waited. The judge sighed, picking up his pen to sign the order that would legally erase my independence. Since the respondent appears unable to participate, I am prepared to grant the emergency petition for the heavy solid oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, authoritative crash. The sudden noise snapped like a gunshot. Every head in the gallery turned instantly. Thomas dropped his confident posture, twisting around in his seat. Brenda gasped, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. Striding down the center aisle was a man who clearly did not belong in a standard family court proceeding. He wore an immaculate razor-sharp navy suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. He moved with the undeniable predatory confidence of a high-powered federal prosecutor. This was Mr. Donovan, one of the most ruthless corporate compliance attorneys from my healthcare network and a man who routinely dismantled billion-dollar financial syndicates for a living. He bypassed the gallery entirely, marching straight through the wooden swinging gate and stepping directly up to my table. "Your Honor," Donovan said, his voice booming with absolute commanding authority, "I am formally entering my appearance as primary legal counsel for the respondent Riley. We vehemently object to this conservatorship petition in its entirety." The judge lowered his pen, his brow furrowing in deep surprise. Mitchell, my parents. High-priced corporate shark immediately jumped to his feet. His face flushed bright red with sudden indignant anger. "Objection, Your Honor." Mitchell barked, pointing a finger across the aisle. "This is an ex parte emergency hearing. Outside counsel has filed no prior notice of appearance. The respondent is actively suffering from a documented psychotic break and is entirely incapable of retaining legal representation. This man has absolutely no standing in this courtroom." Donovan did not even look at Mitchell. He kept his gaze locked firmly on the judge, his posture completely unbothered by the opposing lawyer's frantic outburst. "I have standing, Your Honor, because I possess irrefutable proof that the entire foundation of this emergency petition is built on coordinated, premeditated perjury." Donovan stated his words, hitting the silent room like a physical blow. The petitioners sitting in this courtroom have knowingly submitted fabricated medical narratives to this bench. They are attempting to weaponize the judicial system to commit a massive multi-million-dollar financial fraud. Thomas shot up from his chair, his face contorted with sudden genuine panic. "That is an outrageous lie," he shouted, dropping his concerned father routine entirely. "We are trying to save our daughter's life." The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down hard, the sharp crack silencing the erupting chaos. "Order," the judge commanded, glaring down at Thomas until my father reluctantly sank back into his seat. "Counsel, you are making an incredibly dangerous accusation in my courtroom. You are claiming these concerned family members and their licensed attorney are committing active fraud upon the court. You had better have something substantial to back up that kind of explosive rhetoric, or I will have you removed and sanctioned immediately." Mitchell smirked, regaining his arrogant composure. He adjusted his suit jacket and scoffed loudly. "It is a desperate, delusional conspiracy theory, Your Honor. The respondent is a deeply unstable woman. She has clearly managed to hire a rogue attorney who is perfectly willing to exploit her paranoid delusions. We urge the court to sign the guardianship order immediately so we can transport her to a secure psychiatric facility and get her the medical intervention she desperately requires." Donovan calmly unlatched his leather briefcase. He pulled out a single encrypted digital drive and held it up for the judge to see. "I do not trade in conspiracy theories, Your Honor," Donovan replied, his voice dripping with lethal, icy precision. "I trade in facts. The petitioners have built their entire case on the claim that my client intentionally destroyed her own life-saving medication in a tragic suicide attempt. They claim she is mentally incompetent. I am formally requesting exactly 3 minutes of the court's time to present a single piece of high-definition digital video evidence. This evidence will definitively prove the exact nature of the insulin destruction and expose the petitioner's absolute malicious intent." Mitchell panicked. The smug confidence completely vanished from his face. He slammed his hands down on the petitioner table. "Objection." You cannot admit unverified, undisclosed digital media into an emergency guardianship hearing without allowing the defense proper time to authenticate it. This is a blatant delay tactic designed to stall a critical medical intervention. The judge stared down at Donovan, assessing the sheer gravity of the attorney's federal credentials and the unprecedented boldness of the request. The judge looked back over at Thomas, Brenda, and Vanessa. Perhaps he noticed the sudden, terrified tension radiating from my family. Perhaps he sensed that Mitchell's desperate, frantic objections sounded entirely too defensive for a simple family matter. "I will allow it," the judge declared, his voice cutting through Mitchell's protests. He pointed a stern finger directly at Donovan. "But I am warning you, counselor. If this video is a waste of the court's time or a manipulation of the proceedings, the consequences will be severe. Proceed." Donovan offered a sharp, dangerous smile. He turned toward the bailiff and requested permission to connect his encrypted drive to the courtroom's primary audiovisual system. As the court clerk pulled down the large projection screen behind the witness stand, I slowly lifted my head. I let my shoulders straighten, dropping the heavy, defeated posture I had maintained for days. I turned my head and looked directly across the aisle at Vanessa. Her face was completely drained of color, her eyes wide with a sudden suffocating terror as she realized the execution she had come to watch was actually her own. The mechanical whine of the projector screen descending from the courtroom ceiling felt deafening in the sudden, suffocating silence. Donovan stood at the podium with absolute precision, plugging his encrypted digital drive into the court audiovisual system. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at my parents. He simply tapped a single key on his laptop. The massive screen flickered to life. The overhead lights in the courtroom seemed to dim automatically, plunging the gallery into a heavy, theatrical gloom. The video fed directly from my home office smoke detector began to play. The resolution was flawless. The 4K high-definition footage displayed my downtown Chicago condo in razor-sharp clarity. The audio system, designed to capture hushed corporate conversations during federal audits, picked up every single sound with terrifying accuracy. The entire courtroom jumped as the violent crash of my front door being shoved open echoed through the heavy wooden chamber. They watched a frantic, unhinged Vanessa march into my apartment. They watched her slam her designer handbag onto my glass desk, scattering my compliance documents with brutal force. I kept my posture straight, sitting beside Donovan at the defense table. I did not look at the screen. I did not need to. I had lived it. Instead, I watched the faces of the people who had tried to bury me. Thomas had his hands gripped tightly around the edge of the petitioner table, his knuckles bone white. Brenda was staring at the projection with her mouth slightly open, the calculated weeping mother routine completely forgotten. Kendrick sat in the front row of the gallery, his confident posture dissolving as he watched his wife commit a violent felony on federal-grade surveillance. On the screen, the confrontation escalated. The courtroom watched in absolute paralyzed horror as my physical state rapidly deteriorated. They heard the frantic, piercing shrieks of my continuous glucose monitor blaring its emergency alarm. They watched me collapse onto the hardwood floor, my body seizing and struggling for oxygen as the diabetic ketoacidosis took hold. The raw, unfiltered reality of my medical emergency was broadcast for the judge to see, entirely contradicting the fabricated psychological evaluations Mitchell had submitted just moments ago. Then came the moment that shattered their lives forever. The courtroom watched Vanessa step deliberately over my incapacitated body. They saw her pick up my medical organizer. The audio picked up the crisp, distinct snap of the insulin vial caps being twisted off. Vanessa leaned over the stainless steel sink, her face clearly visible, twisted into a mask of pure sadistic delight. "If I do not have diabetes, then you will stay healthy too." Vanessa's voice rang out, filling the courtroom with a sickly, mocking clarity. The sound of my life-saving medication pouring directly down the drain echoed off the marble walls. A collective audible gasp rippled through the gallery. The judge leaned forward over his heavy wooden bench, the color completely drained from his face. His skin turned a stark ashen white. He was a seasoned family court judge who had seen decades of bitter domestic disputes, but he was currently watching a cold-blooded execution. He realized in real time that he had been moments away from granting total legal power to a family of predators. "You are sweating already," Vanessa's voice continued on the recording, cutting through the stunned silence of the room. "What is your blood sugar 390? How long until your organs shut down?" Then came the manic, delighted laughter. It was a chilling sociopathic sound that left absolutely zero room for misinterpretation. There was no temporary insanity. There was no tragic misunderstanding. The courtroom watched her drop the empty glass vials into the sink, grab my emergency backup pens, and deliberately crush them into shattered plastic under her heavy designer boot. They watched her snatch my cell phone, walk out the front door, and secure the deadbolt from the outside, intentionally trapping me inside to die. The video abruptly ended, leaving a frozen frame of my empty locked front door on the massive screen. The silence that slammed into the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that only exists in the immediate aftermath of a bomb detonating. Mitchell, the high-priced, ruthless corporate attorney who had swaggered into the room demanding my institutionalization, reacted with the pure survival instinct of a cornered predator. He did not object. He did not attempt to contextualize the footage. He did not utter a single word in defense of his clients. He simply reached down, grabbed his thick legal binder, and shoved it roughly into his leather briefcase. The sharp click of his briefcase latches snapping shut sounded like a gunshot. Mitchell took 3 large, deliberate steps away from the petitioner table, physically and legally distancing himself from Thomas and Brenda. He was abandoning the sinking ship before the federal government could drag him down with it. I turned my head slowly across the aisle, locking my gaze directly onto Vanessa. The smug, victorious smirk she had been wearing just 5 minutes ago had completely vanished. Her pristine, arrogant facade had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically around the room like a trapped animal realizing the cage doors had just slammed shut. The sheer, breathless terror radiating from her was palpable. She looked at the judge, who was staring back at her with undisguised revulsion. She looked at her husband, Kendrick, who had slumped back in his gallery seat, his face buried in his hands, as he realized his money-laundering empire was now hopelessly tethered to an attempted murder charge. Vanessa finally looked at me. There was no condescension left. There was no golden child superiority. There was only the raw, suffocating panic of a woman who had just watched her entire life end on a projection screen. I did not smile. I did not blink. I just sat beside my federal attorney, projecting the cold, untouchable certainty of a woman who had meticulously engineered her own perfect justice. I pushed my chair back from the defense table. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished marble floor, breaking the paralyzing spell that had fallen over the room. I did not shuffle. I did not keep my shoulders hunched or my eyes cast down to the floor. I stood up to my full height. I rolled my shoulders back, shedding the pathetic, broken victim persona as easily as taking off a winter coat. My posture was rigid, commanding, and absolute. I turned my gaze away from my terrified sister and looked directly up at the elevated bench. The judge was staring at me, his eyes wide, finally seeing the sharp, highly analytical compliance auditor instead of the severely medicated psychiatric patient Mitchell had just spent 20 minutes describing. "That was not a suicide attempt, Your Honor," I said. My voice was no longer a weak, trembling whisper. It rang out through the cavernous courtroom, perfectly steady, chillingly calm, and impossible to ignore. That was attempted murder for financial gain. The sheer gravity of those words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the entire petitioner table exploded into absolute chaos. Thomas sprang to his feet so fast his heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the floor. His face had turned a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. The composed, wealthy patriarch who had marched into this building demanding total control over my life was completely gone. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his chest heaving, as he frantically tried to salvage his rapidly disintegrating reality. Your Honor! Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with unprecedented panic. This is a complete misrepresentation. That video is entirely out of context. It was a prank, a terrible, tasteless joke between sisters that looks incredibly bad on a security camera, but I assure you Vanessa would never actually harm her. Riley is confused. She is deeply unwell and manipulating digital media to punish us for trying to get her medical help. Brenda leaped up right beside him, desperately trying to deploy her usual weaponized tears. But the performance was utterly broken. She was hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured hands shaking violently as she clutched the lapels of her pristine white pantsuit. She is lying! Brenda shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing wildly off the wood-paneled walls. My daughter is a sick, paranoid woman. You cannot possibly believe this edited garbage over her own family. We are trying to save her. I did not flinch at their screaming. I did not even look at them. I kept my eyes locked with the judge. The judge's face had hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. He had sat on that bench listening to their high-priced lawyer spin a tragic tale of my supposed mental decline. He had been mere seconds away from signing a legal order that would have handed my entire existence over to a syndicate of predators. He recognized immediately that he had been aggressively and maliciously played. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block. The crack was deafening, firing through the courtroom like a cannon shot. Sit down and shut your mouths, the judge roared, his voice booming with such ferocious authority that both Thomas and Brenda physically recoiled. You will not speak another word in my courtroom unless I explicitly instruct you to do so. If either of you utter one more syllable of perjury in front of this bench, I will hold you both in criminal contempt and have you remanded to county lockup before you can even blink. Thomas sank slowly back into his seat, his jaw trembling. Brenda collapsed into her chair, covering her face with her hands as genuine, suffocating terror finally took hold. The judge pointed a shaking finger at Mitchell, who was still standing as far away from his clients as the aisle would physically allow. Counsel, the judge growled, if you had any prior knowledge of this surveillance footage or the actual nature of the respondent's medical emergency, your career in this state is permanently over. Mitchell raised both his hands in a gesture of absolute desperate surrender. I had absolutely no knowledge of this evidence, Your Honor, he stated quickly. His professional arrogance entirely evaporated. My clients provided me with sworn affidavits regarding a suicide attempt. I was operating strictly on the fabricated narrative they presented to me. I formally request to withdraw as their legal counsel effective immediately. The judge ignored him, turning his intense gaze back down to me and Donovan. Attempted murder for financial gain is a massive allegation. Miss Riley, the judge said, his tone shifting from furious to deeply analytical. The video clearly demonstrates severe malice and the intentional destruction of life-sustaining medication. But what exactly is the financial motive here? Why would your own family orchestrate such a horrific scenario? I placed my hands flat on the defense table, leaning forward slightly. Because, Your Honor, my brother-in-law Kendrick is currently drowning in a frozen financial crisis. I explained, my voice echoing clearly through the silent room. He and my parents needed immediate, untraceable capital to secure an emergency private bridge loan by the end of business today. They needed a high-value asset to use as collateral, and I own a luxury downtown condo completely free and clear. I glanced back at Kendrick, who was practically melting into the gallery bench, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him. When I refused to sign my home over to them 3 days ago, they became desperate. I continued, keeping my eyes fixed on the judge. My sister used an emergency key to break into my apartment. She intentionally triggered a severe diabetic emergency, destroyed my medication, and locked me inside to die. Their plan was incredibly simple. They needed me either dead or legally incapacitated so my father could secure this exact conservatorship. Once you signed that order granting him power of attorney, he was going to liquidate my home before the end of the week and wash the cash directly into Kendrick's failing holding companies. The judge stared at me, processing the sheer calculated brutality of the scheme. He looked at the projection screen, which was still displaying the frozen frame of my locked front door. He then looked at Vanessa, who was sitting motionless in the gallery, her face buried in her hands, taking ragged, panicked breaths as her entire luxury lifestyle collapsed into dust. The judge slowly leaned back in his leather chair. He did not ask any more questions. He did not need to. The pristine video evidence, combined with the incredibly precise financial motive I had just laid out, created an airtight, inescapable narrative of criminal conspiracy. Bailiff, the judge commanded, his voice cold and resolute. The uniformed armed officer standing by the jury box immediately stepped forward, resting his hand casually near his utility belt. Yes, Your Honor. Secure the heavy double doors at the back of this courtroom, the judge instructed, his eyes locking onto Thomas and Brenda. Nobody leaves this chamber. Lock the exits. We are going to maintain this exact holding pattern until the proper authorities are brought in to address the severe felony offenses that have clearly transpired here today. The bailiff marched swiftly down the center aisle. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolts engaging on the main courtroom doors echoed loudly, sealing my family inside the trap they had so arrogantly built for me. I remained standing tall at the defense table, feeling the first exhilarating rush of absolute freedom. They were completely locked in, and the true reckoning had not even begun. The echo of the heavy deadbolts engaging had barely settled into the stunned silence of the courtroom when a sudden violent pounding rattled the massive oak doors at the back of the gallery. It was not a polite, hesitant knock. It was the forceful, uncompromising strike of law enforcement demanding immediate entry. The armed bailiff, his hand resting cautiously near his utility belt, glanced up at the elevated bench. The judge, still recovering from the shock of the surveillance video, gave a sharp, definitive nod. The bailiff turned the brass key and pulled the heavy doors open. A highly coordinated squad of federal agents flooded into the courtroom. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency that instantly sucked all the remaining air out of the room. These were not local beat cops responding to a domestic disturbance call. They wore dark, tactical windbreakers, with bold yellow letters emblazoned across the back, indicating the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Flanking them were three grim-faced United States Marshals, their postures rigid, and their hands resting securely on their duty weapons. Thomas, desperate to salvage any shred of his wealthy, respectable patriarch facade, immediately misread the entire terrifying situation. His arrogant mind simply could not comprehend that his own financial crimes were catching up to him. He saw law enforcement swarming the aisles and automatically assumed the judge had hit a panic button regarding the horrifying security footage Donovan had just played on the projector. In a breathtaking display of narcissistic self-preservation, Thomas instantly turned on his golden child. "Officers!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking as he waved his hands frantically toward the gallery where Vanessa sat completely paralyzed. "She is right there. My daughter Vanessa acted completely alone. We had absolutely zero knowledge of her violent behavior toward her sister. We are entirely cooperative with the court. Take her into custody." The lead federal investigator stepped forward, separating herself from the tactical squad. It was Special Agent Foster, the same sharp, no-nonsense woman who had meticulously reviewed my forensic audit in the subterranean parking garage 24 hours earlier. She did not even glance at the sobbing, hyperventilating Vanessa in the gallery. She marched straight down the center aisle, her heavy boots clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. She bypassed my sister entirely and walked directly up to the petitioner table where Thomas and Brenda were standing. Foster reached into the inner pocket of her tactical jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily stamped stack of federal warrants. She locked eyes with my father, her expression carved from solid, unforgiving ice. "Thomas and Brenda," Agent Foster announced, her voice projecting with absolute devastating clarity across the silent courtroom. "You are not here as witnesses to a domestic dispute. You are the primary targets of a massive multi-agency federal sting operation." Brenda let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp. Her knees buckled beneath her pristine white pantsuit, and she collapsed heavily into her wooden chair, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in sheer, unadulterated horror. Thomas turned a sickly mottled shade of gray. The confident, booming voice that had spent 3 decades belittling my career and mocking my medical condition completely vanished. He stood there, opening and closing his mouth, without producing a single sound, looking like a fish thrown onto a dry deck. By order of the United States District Court. Agent Foster continued unfolding the legal documents with lethal precision. I am executing federal arrest warrants for both of you, as well as for your son-in-law Kendrick. You are being officially charged with multiple counts of systemic wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit Medicare fraud. The judge leaned slowly over his heavy wooden bench, watching the execution of the syndicate with intense, silent approval. He realized that the fraudulent conservatorship petition sitting on his desk was merely a desperate attempt to fund a collapsing criminal enterprise. Foster turned her piercing gaze toward Kendrick. My brother-in-law was actively trying to shrink into the wooden slats of the gallery bench right behind the petitioner table. The custom-tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Kendrick Agent Foster stated, taking a deliberate step toward the supposedly untouchable real estate mogul. You are additionally being charged with federal money laundering and operating a continuing criminal enterprise under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. We know exactly how you wash the stolen government funds. We have tracked the fake architectural invoices, and we have fully mapped the phantom dermatology consultations your in-laws submitted. We have already seized the servers for every single one of your limited liability companies, and the Internal Revenue Service has permanently frozen your holding accounts. The absolute specificity of her words hit my family like a physical wrecking ball. They realized in a split second that the federal government knew everything. The secret medical billing, the upcoded surgeries, the empty commercial properties used to wash the dirty money, it was all entirely exposed. Kendrick's facade of the untouchable corporate tycoon shattered instantly into a million pathetic pieces. He looked at the heavily armed United States Marshals stepping into tactical positions around his bench, and sheer, unfiltered panic hijacked his brain. He pointed a trembling, desperate finger directly at my parents. "I just moved the money," Kendrick stammered, his deep voice pitching upward into a frantic, cowardly whine. The medi spa billing was all Thomas. He set up the phantom patient profiles. He orchestrated the insurance fraud. I just provided the real estate accounts for the cash transfers. I will cooperate. I will give you everything you need on them. I want full immunity. I stood silently beside Donovan at the defense table, watching the ultimate poetic betrayal unfold. The family that had proudly united at an upscale Chicago steakhouse to extort my home, the family that had happily covered up my attempted murder just to secure a bridge loan, was now viciously tearing each other apart to save their own skins. The profound family legacy Kendrick had boasted about meant absolutely nothing when faced with the terrifying concrete reality of federal prison. Agent Foster did not entertain Kendrick's frantic, pathetic attempts to cut a plea deal in the middle of a family court gallery. She simply folded the federal warrants, tucked them back into her jacket, and gestured sharply to the squad of agents flanking her. The tactical team surged forward. The polished, quiet dignity of the family court was instantly obliterated by the synchronized, heavy movements of federal law enforcement. 2 United States Marshals descended upon Thomas, grabbing him by the shoulders of his custom-tailored suit. Thomas thrashed wildly, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he realized his supreme authority was entirely meaningless against federal power. He tried to twist away, shouting that he was an esteemed business owner and demanding to speak to the judge, but the marshals seamlessly pinned him face down against the petitioner table. The sharp metallic ratcheting of handcuffs echoing off the wood sent a brutal shockwave through the room. Kendrick completely unraveled. Watching his domineering father-in-law get physically subdued triggered a pure, cowardly survival instinct. The polished real estate developer facade melted away, leaving a desperate, terrified man willing to sell out anyone to save himself. He scrambled backward, crashing into the gallery benches, pointing a shaking finger directly at Thomas's pinned head. "I am telling you, it was all him!" Kendrick shrieked, his deep voice cracking loudly. "Thomas built the phantom patient database. He set up the fraudulent Medicare routing numbers. I just provided the commercial accounts to hold the cash. I did not touch a single medical file. You have to give me a deal. I will testify against him right now." Thomas wrenched his head sideways against the table, spitting pure venom at his son-in-law. "You spineless coward!" Thomas roared, straining against the marshals holding him down. "You took every dime we gave you to fund those empty construction sites. You knew exactly where the cash came from. You are going to rot in federal prison right alongside us." A massive federal agent grabbed Kendrick by the collar, hauling him roughly to his feet. Kendrick kicked and scrambled, begging Vanessa to call his defense attorneys, but his wife was entirely unresponsive, frozen in her own personal nightmare. The agent slammed Kendrick against the back wall, pulled his arms sharply behind his back, and secured the steel cuffs around his wrists. The Miranda rights were being read aloud from 3 different directions simultaneously, a chaotic, overlapping chorus of absolute legal destruction. Brenda, realizing her entire empire of wealth status and unearned superiority had just evaporated, resorted to her ultimate desperate defense mechanism. She threw herself onto the courtroom floor, clutching her chest and gasping for air. She began to hyperventilate with loud theatrical heaves, clawing at the collar of her pristine white pantsuit. "I need a doctor," Brenda wailed, her eyes darting frantically around the room to see if anyone was buying the performance. "My heart is failing. You cannot arrest me. I am having a major medical emergency. Someone call an ambulance right now." Agent Foster did not even blink. She gestured to a tactical medic standing near the courtroom doors. The medic walked over, knelt beside Brenda, and quickly pressed 2 fingers against her carotid artery. He checked her pulse for exactly 5 seconds before standing back up and looking directly at Foster. "Her heart rate is slightly elevated from adrenaline, but her rhythm is perfectly stable," the medic reported dryly. "She is completely faking it. She is entirely medically cleared for transport." Foster offered a cold, satisfied nod. 2 agents immediately hauled a screaming, thrashing Brenda up from the floor. They clamped the handcuffs onto her wrists with zero hesitation, completely ignoring her demands for a private hospital room. While the federal agents processed Thomas, Brenda, and Kendrick for the massive financial conspiracy, a different figure stepped forward from the back of the law enforcement group. He was not wearing a tactical windbreaker. He wore a plain, dark gray suit, holding a silver badge clipped to his belt. He was a senior detective with the Chicago Police Department, and his eyes were locked entirely on the gallery. He walked slowly and deliberately down the aisle, stepping right past the federal chaos until he stood directly in front of Vanessa. Vanessa looked up at him, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. She had watched the federal agents ignore her to arrest her husband and parents. For a fleeting, desperate second, she had clearly convinced herself that she was somehow dodging the bullet, that the authorities were only interested in the Medicare money laundering scheme. Vanessa, the local detective, said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of sympathy. "I am placing you under arrest." Vanessa shook her head violently, pressing herself back into the wooden bench as if she could merge with the architecture. "No, you do not understand," she stammered, fresh tears spilling over her mascara. "I do not have anything to do with the billing fraud. I am just a housewife. My husband handles all the corporate finances. I did not steal any government money." "I am not here for the financial fraud," the detective replied, pulling a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "I am here for the video. You are being charged with attempted murder in the first-degree aggravated assault and the intentional endangerment of a vulnerable adult." The reality of the state charges slammed into Vanessa with the force of a speeding train. The federal financial crimes meant decades in prison for her parents, but attempted murder meant she was facing a lifetime behind bars with absolutely zero chance of parole. The smug, golden child who had stomped on my life-saving medication was suddenly confronted with the inescapable, terrifying consequences of her own sadistic arrogance. She completely snapped. As the detective reached down and grabbed her arm, Vanessa let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream. She kicked wildly at the wooden benches, fighting with an unhinged, feral desperation. She screamed for Kendrick, but he was already being marched out the heavy double doors by the federal marshals. She wailed for her parents, but Thomas and Brenda were being dragged down the center aisle in chains, entirely incapable of protecting their favorite daughter. The detective yanked her arms forcefully behind her back. The cold, heavy steel clicked loudly around her wrists, locking tightly into place. Vanessa dropped to her knees, sobbing with a frantic, breathless terror, begging the detective to look at her bank accounts. screaming that she had enough money to post any bail they wanted. "You are not getting bail for an unprovoked attempted homicide captured on ultra-high-definition federal surveillance," the detective stated flatly, hauling her back to her feet by her elbows. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." The local detective firmly gripped Vanessa by her elbows, hauling her up from the polished marble floor. Her expensive designer dress, the one she had worn specifically to celebrate my institutionalization, was now wrinkled and stained with her own panicked tears. Her heavy, erratic breathing echoed in the cavernous space as she struggled uselessly against the cold steel locked tightly around her wrists. I stepped away from the defense table. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely unburdened. Every single eye remaining in the courtroom, from the stunned bailiff to the presiding judge, watched me walk down the center aisle. Just beyond the heavy wooden doors, I could hear the fading, muffled shouts of Thomas and Kendrick as the United States Marshals loaded them into armored federal transport vehicles. Brenda was already gone, hauled away, in a state of hyperventilating shock, to face decades of wire fraud charges. The entire wealthy, arrogant dynasty they had built on the backs of stolen Medicare funds had been utterly obliterated in less than 5 minutes. The fake luxury empire was dead. Now it was just me and the golden child. I stopped 2 feet away from Vanessa. The detective paused, allowing me the space to confront the woman who had tried to end my life. Vanessa stopped thrashing. For a fraction of a second, a pathetic, desperate glimmer of hope flashed across her tear-streaked face. Her narcissistic brain was trying to process the impossible. She actually thought I was going to intervene. She thought the old submissive sister she had bullied for decades would step in, offer a forgiving smile, and beg the detective for leniency. I looked her up and down, taking in the messy hair, the trembling jaw, and the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her skin. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt the icy, calculating precision of a woman who had just flawlessly executed a perfect checkmate. I let a cold, clinical smile touch my lips. "You are sweating already," I said. My voice was pitched perfectly level. It was the exact sickly sweet mocking tone she had used in my kitchen 10 days prior. Vanessa gasped. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she recognized her own brutal words coming back to destroy her. Her breath hitched in her throat, a choked sound of pure realization. "What is your blood pressure?" I continued, taking a single step closer so she could not look away. "How long until your whole life shuts down?" The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The realization that I had orchestrated this entire downfall, that I had used her own malicious arrogance to build an inescapable federal trap, finally broke her completely. Vanessa let out a guttural, agonizing wail. It was not a cry of sorrow or remorse. It was the primal, terrifying scream of a predator that had just realized it was permanently caught in a lethal snare. The detective did not pause to let her process the poetic justice. He shoved her forward, marching her forcefully down the aisle toward the exit. I watched her stumble, her cries echoing wildly off the high ceilings. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing a swarm of local reporters and news cameras that the federal task force had quietly tipped off. The flashing bulbs illuminated Vanessa's tear-stained, horrified face as she was dragged out into the harsh daylight, her hands cuffed behind her back. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off her hysterical sobbing entirely. I stood in the sudden ringing silence of the courtroom. The air felt incredibly light, as if a toxic, suffocating fog had finally been vented from the room. The oppressive weight I had carried my entire life, the constant belittling, the financial extortion, the blatant disregard for my health, was completely gone. Donovan, the high-powered federal prosecutor who had brilliantly sprung the trap on my behalf, walked over and stood beside me. He snapped his leather briefcase shut, looking incredibly satisfied with the total destruction he had just facilitated. He offered me a firm, respectful nod. The judge slowly descended from his elevated bench. He looked at the large projection screen, which was now blank, and then looked directly at me. There was a profound, unspoken respect in his eyes. He realized the sheer magnitude of the emotional and intellectual warfare I had just navigated to protect myself and expose a massive criminal syndicate. He understood that I had walked into his courtroom as prey and walked out as the undisputed victor. The nightmare was officially over. The family that had mocked my illness, threatened my independence, and attempted to murder me for a real estate bailout no longer existed. They were completely dismantled, stripped of their fake wealth, and permanently locked inside the federal justice system, where their entitlement would mean absolutely nothing. I turned toward the exit, my posture straight and my head held high. I did not look back at the petitioner table where my parents had sat so arrogantly just minutes before. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer the family scapegoat or the defective daughter. I was a survivor who had surgically removed a deadly disease from my life, and I was finally walking out into the world on my own terms. 2 weeks had passed since the heavy oak doors of the family court slammed shut on my former life. I sat outside on the expansive balcony of my downtown Chicago condo, the very home they had so arrogantly tried to steal from me. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the glass and steel of the city skyline. The crisp air filled my lungs clean and completely unburdened. My sanctuary was now fully secured. Following the arrests, I had hired a top-tier security firm to install new biometric locks, upgraded reinforced doors, and a direct emergency line to local law enforcement. I was completely, undeniably safe inside my own walls. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee and tapped the screen of my digital tablet. The local and national news outlets were having an absolute field day with the fallout. The headlines were bold, relentless, and incredibly satisfying to read over breakfast. Boutique Medi Spa empire collapses in multi-million-dollar federal fraud raid. Real estate mogul exposed in massive healthcare Ponzi scheme. Wealthy family indicted in bizarre murder and money laundering plot. The articles detailed the sheer breathtaking scope of Thomas and Brenda's betrayal of the public trust. The federal prosecutors had unsealed the grand jury indictments, revealing decades of phantom billing, stolen taxpayer funds, and forged medical records. My parents were currently sitting in separate federal holding facilities. The judge had firmly denied them bail, citing their extensive access to illicit offshore funds and classifying them as extreme flight risks. Their assets were entirely frozen. Their luxury imported cars had been impounded by federal agents, and their pristine, sprawling suburban estate had been formally seized by the government. The flawless, wealthy image they had spent their entire lives cultivating was completely destroyed. They were now just 2 federal inmates awaiting a trial that would undoubtedly end with them spending the rest of their natural lives behind bars. Kendrick was facing his own absolute nightmare. He was drowning under a mountain of racketeering and money laundering charges. The financial media was tearing apart his fake mogul persona, exposing him as nothing more than a glorified, incompetent bagman for my parents' criminal syndicate. He had desperately tried to flip on Thomas to secure a plea deal during his initial interrogation, but the federal agents already had all the evidence they needed from my pristine compliance audit. His offer of cooperation was entirely worthless. The government did not need his testimony, and he was left holding the bag for dozens of fraudulent shell companies. And then there was Vanessa. The local news featured a dedicated segment on her arraignment hearing. She was not granted the luxury of a clean, quiet, white-collar federal holding cell like her husband and parents. Because she was charged with attempted murder in the first degree and the intentional endangerment of a vulnerable adult, she was being held without bail in the maximum security wing of the county jail. The reporters described how she had sobbed hysterically during her hearing, begging the state judge for house arrest, claiming she was a fragile victim of circumstance. The judge had looked at her with pure disgust and firmly denied the request, citing the brutal, undeniable nature of the high-definition surveillance video. The golden child was now locked in an 8x10 concrete cell, stripped of her designer dresses, her expensive lifestyle, and her unearned malicious superiority. She was finally experiencing the exact terror and helplessness she had so gleefully inflicted upon me. A soft, familiar chime sounded from my wrist. I glanced down at my smartwatch. My continuous glucose monitor displayed a perfectly flat, steady line. My blood sugar was completely optimal. There were no violent, life-threatening spikes of adrenaline today. There were no terrifying crashes induced by artificial stress, physical assault, or familial abuse. My body was at peace, functioning exactly as it should, when permanently removed from a highly toxic, dangerous environment. I took another deep breath, letting the cool morning breeze wash over my face. For 30 years, I had allowed them to dictate my worth. I had internalized their cruel comments, their blatant dismissal of my medical condition, and their relentless manipulation. I had believed the lie that because we shared genetics, I owed them my loyalty and my silence. But family is not defined by blood. It is defined by respect, care, and basic human decency. They possessed absolutely none of those qualities. They viewed me as a defective liability, a broken spreadsheet checker, right up until the exact moment I became a convenient financial asset to exploit. I looked out over the sprawling city below me, watching the early morning traffic move through the streets. I did not just survive their cruelty. I did not just escape a locked room and a deadly diabetic coma. I had taken a metaphorical scalpel to my own life and surgically eradicated the disease that had been slowly poisoning me for decades. I had excised the narcissism, the greed, and the malice with absolute undeniable precision. I had used my analytical mind, the very trait they had always mocked as boring and robotic, to dismantle a massive criminal empire and secure my own permanent freedom. The coffee in my mug was warm and comforting. The apartment behind me was quiet, safe, and entirely my own. There were no heavy footsteps to fear, no sudden ambushes, no cruel laughter waiting to tear me down when I was at my most vulnerable. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried my entire life was completely gone, replaced by a brilliant, undeniable lightness. I set my tablet down on the small glass table and leaned back against the comfortable cushions of my balcony chair. A genuine, unburdened smile spread across my face. For the first time in my 30 years of existence, I was truly, completely, and irreversibly free to live my life in total peace. The harrowing journey of surviving a toxic family dynamic teaches us one profound and undeniable lesson. Biology does not automatically entitle anyone to your peace, your resources, or your life. For too long, society has pushed the narrative that we must forgive and accommodate our relatives simply because we share the same DNA. However, this story powerfully dismantles that dangerous myth. When the people who are supposed to protect you become your absolute greatest threat, choosing to walk away is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of ultimate self-preservation. We witness how narcissism and greed can completely blind individuals to basic human decency, pushing them to commit unspeakable betrayals for the sake of maintaining a fabricated image of wealth and superiority. The protagonist's survival depended entirely on her ability to see her family for who they truly were, rather than who they were supposed to be. She did not wait for them to miraculously change, nor did she try to fix their deeply ingrained malice. Instead, she used her intelligence and unbreakable resolve to establish ironclad boundaries and enforce real devastating consequences. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine care, and unwavering support, not extortion and manipulation. If you find yourself in a room where your worth is constantly diminished and your well-being is threatened, you have the absolute right to lock the door behind you and never look back. Please share this message with anyone who needs the courage to break free from toxic relationships, and let us know your own experiences in the comments below.